So what health lessons can you learn from your dog or your pet for that matter? It doesn't have to be a dog. The first one is diet matters. I grew up around rescue dogs and most of them were mixed breeds. And that usually has some advantages over purebreds. And the reason for that advantage, of course, is because oftentimes you don't have to deal, well, you definitely don't have to worry about the dog being severely inbred, and oftentimes you don't have to worry about breed specific diseases. In 2011, my husband and I adopted our first Doberman from the Larimer Humane Society. At least he looked purebred. I don't have the papers to support that, and I really think it's silly to pay for papers. With that adoption came the responsibility of figuring out what common health conditions were associated with Dobermans. We researched the diseases most common to Dobies and found that they're prone to dilated cardiomyopathy. That is a mouthful, so the acronym for that is DCM, and this is enlarged heart muscle. Additional research suggested that a grain-free diet could exacerbate DCM. However, Abe didn't do well with dog food containing wheat especially. I'm not a huge fan of corn as a dietary staple for any animal, and this was back in 2011, while the whole dog food industry and the bougie dog foods were growing at the time. You know, we weren't exactly flush with cash at the time, so we were looking to give him the best diet possible on our income. And this required additional research to figure out why a grain-free diet might contribute to an enlarged heart in Dobies. It turns out it's because the potatoes and the legumes, which are common in grain-free dog food, interfere with taurine absorption. Before being introduced to Ayurveda, which really happened only quite recently for me, it was common for me not to consider my diet. And here, I'm not talking about a cheeseburger and fries versus quinoa, roasted potatoes, broccoli, and chicken. I'm talking, how often was I eating potatoes or beans, legumes in any form? And should I consider adding more beef into my own diet for proper taurine levels? It was also common for me not to really think about the bulk of what I was eating and how this might be interfering with the absorption of necessary nutrients. Now, with my recent fall off the deep end into the world of Ayurveda, this question has become so much more profound, and it's really revolutionary how much I can attribute diet to my symptoms. And again, this goes back to not just what I eat, but how I eat, being sure that it's warm meals and not cold food. So learning about the connection, of course, you know, with Abe back in 2011, this was well before any of that. So just learning about the connection between taurine, a grain-free diet, and my dog's heart health helped to open my eyes to just how important diet really is to health. The second one is advocate for yourself. Become your own health advocate and stand up to your doctor. This one is tough. So this goes back to a different rescue. My dog Bogey, who I adopted when I was in college, was diagnosed with a heart murmur when I first got him. Years later, following a scary episode on Easter morning of 2013, I was in the emergency area at Colorado State University. This is back when we were living in Colorado. So I was at the CSU Vet Hospital with a veterinarian and no less than 2 vet techs who were trying to hold Bogey down while they strapped a blood pressure cuff to his tail. That still small voice inside of me kept nudging me to say something, nudging them to ask me to stop, or, you know, nudging me so that I would ask them to stop, and just give Bogey a chance to settle down before they tried to strap that blood pressure cuff to his tail, or whether or not we really even needed his blood pressure for them to go ahead and prescribe him. In this case, it was a Nalapril, which is a blood pressure reducer. I believe there were additional reasons why the vet was looking at enalapril, mostly because he already suspected CHF based on, just listening to Bogey's heart, and they'd run some blood tests. So the blood pressure really was just this extra little piece that I'm not even sure was necessary. And even if it were not something that they needed to fight a 20-pound dog to get, that 3 full-grown people needed to fight a 20-pound dog to get. So needless to say, when I did not listen to that still small voice. And when they finally got that blood pressure cuff on my little dog's tail, his blood pressure was high. Surprise, surprise. So if I'd had that to do over again, I'd have told the doctor to stop fighting my dog and either wait for him to calm down or to just go ahead with the prescription because he had enough information otherwise. So how this plays into your own health is sometimes you don't need the diagnostic test to make the changes that you need to better your health. And a great example of this is celiac disease. Yes, in order to conclusively confirm that you have celiac disease, you have to have a biopsy. However, you don't have to have the biopsy to make the changes that you need in order to improve your health if you do have celiac. So celiac disease, of course, requires treatment with a gluten-free diet. So this is no wheat, no barley, no rye. Yes, beer contains barley, so no beer. So you don't need the biopsy to stop eating those things and avoid food that might be contaminated with those things. The actions that you take and see whether your health improves, the actions that you take on your own can be conclusive enough. You don't necessarily need a formal diagnosis. Now, this is not always an option, and sometimes it really is necessary to have the test performed, and because sometimes you really need to know what's going on. However, if it's something where you're suspecting or something where everything else has been exhausted and this is kind of the last piece, just consider your options. Consider whether you have any options, which leads to the next point on consider the alternatives. And here, when I say alternatives, I'm not necessarily talking about all of the options of Western medicine. It's more so consider alternative modalities to support any diagnosis. So when Bogey stopped eating, acupuncture helped. Western medicine offers so much power for both diagnosis and also for symptom relief. However, to use Western medicine only is to ignore the ocean of health benefits that are offered by alternative modalities. I've experienced this in my own life as well, but seeing how much acupuncture helped my dog was what really sold me on the power held by these alternative healing modalities. Inaction is also a choice. And this is especially true for pets. It's especially true for when you're taking care of, so this one applies maybe less for your own health, or at least I hope here it applies less for your own health and really more so for when you're the caretaker. It's so tough to know what to do in the moment. And it's so tough to know whether or not you're making the right decision. And oftentimes the decision of taking no action has all this extra guilt attached. When Abe was diagnosed with a bone cancer on his rib, we consulted with a vet oncologist for the options. The osteosarcoma on his rib popped up fast. So it first became palpable in late November of 2021. And at first it felt like a lipoma, which is just a benign fatty lump. It began growing quickly and it started to feel different. It started to feel harder and immovable over just a couple of weeks. And by the time he went in for his biopsy in December, the mass had nearly doubled in size from what it was in late November. So before I kind of finish out this thought on inaction as an option too, I wanted to circle back around to that advocate for yourself once more, because when Abe went back for his rib biopsy in December, I requested that a spot on his leg, one that had been bothering me for quite a while and was continually dismissed by the vet as a lipoma, I requested that they biopsy that one as well. And that one came back as cancerous. And this really chafed me, mostly because Abe had been in for surgery at the beginning of November to have a spot removed from a different part of his body. It was one, to be honest, I don't even know what it was at this point. I think it was one that we suspected to be melanoma, and melanoma in dogs oftentimes is so different than it is in humans. For example, Abe had several melanoma spots removed over the years. Before that surgery, I'd asked about this spot on his leg, and it was dismissed as probably a lipoma and not even biopsied. And it was one that I asked that they go ahead and biopsy, since they were biopsying his rib anyway in December, and it came back cancerous, and it was a bad cancer. It was a spindle cell sarcoma. So yeah, still kicking myself in the butt for not learning that lesson on advocate for yourself, in spite of the fact that I talk about it all the time. So one more example of advocate for yourself, and this goes to my friend who in her 30s had a mole on her leg, and she went into her dermatologist and asked him to take a look at it. And he said, well, it looks fine. It does not look cancerous. She rescheduled a visit to him a couple months later and said, hey, I know you think it looks fine. It's bothering me. It like the idea of it being there. I don't like the way it looks. I think about it too much. Can you just biopsy it? He took a biopsy of it. It was melanoma. She now has, it's at least a 4-inch incision on her leg where they had to go in, remove that mole, in addition to removing all suspect tissue and stitch her up. And so it's about a 4-inch, or it's at least a 4-inch scar on her leg from that. So anyways, if you walk away from this episode with nothing else, please advocate for yourself. It's okay to be the squeaky wheel. It's okay to ask your doctor. They can roll their eyes. That's fine. They are not you. They don't have to, they don't have to live with what you're living with every day. They don't have the same worries you have, none of that. If it's worrying you, squeak. And if your doctor doesn't listen, find another doctor. So now back over to this point of inaction being a choice too. Once the biopsy results came back, we were referred to vet oncologists who offered surgery, including rib removal or radiation, as the recommended courses of action. At this point, Abe was at least 11 years old, since the best guess on his age when we adopted him was about a year old. Now, surgical removal of a rib in a dog involves resecting muscles that they use for walking. And so you just think about how a dog walks on all fours. And so they're moving one of those major muscles. They're having to resect that and reattach it where it doesn't kind of normally go. So as my sister, a nurse practitioner, describes it, in humans, removal of a rib is a big ass surgery. And it would be at least that big for Abe, even if we were only talking about his floating rib, which I should have mentioned that mass that we found was on his floating rib. So surgery was out of the question. We opted for radiation. If I had it to do over again, I'd have chosen the third option, which is no treatment. When Abe went in for his first dose of radiation, he was able to go for walks. He was able to play with his brother, who's another Dobie rescue named Moose, and his appetite was healthy. By the third day of treatment, all of that had changed. It took 2 months to get his appetite back. This leads into some pretty dog-specific health lessons. The first of them is stomach tacking in barrel-chested dogs who've had abdominal surgery should be recommended as a prophylactic treatment for bloat anytime an abdominal organ or mass from the abdominal cavity is removed. Why is this so important? Well, first of all, in hindsight, Abe suffered from bloat or transient bloat after spleen surgery. This is something we didn't know at the time. We kept taking him back into the vet because of his inappetite after his spleen surgery and not being able to get anything down him. And yeah, they never once mentioned, oh, well, this is bloat or this is transient bloat, where his stomach is essentially what's happening is his stomach is twisting. And this is a medical emergency if it does not correct itself. Why this was a problem in radiation is because every course of radiation, Abe was put under anesthesia and then he was placed on some kind of platform that rotated his body throughout the treatment. And so I imagine his body was being rotated in weird angles and probably upside down. And so this lended itself to making his stomach twist again. So normally for dogs that have not had abdominal surgery, it's not a problem. However, Abe was a deep chested dog. He'd had his spleen removed. And he'd had his spleen removed actually due to a benign mass that started bleeding internally. So being rotated onto his back while under anesthesia resulted in his stomach transiently going into torsion when he ate, which resulted in that potentially life-threatening condition known as bloat. An emergency trip to Veterinary Emergency Group in Encinitas, which is hands down the coolest vet clinic I have ever been to in my entire life, taught us that lesson about the importance of stomach tacking during abdominal surgery. Now, this veterinary emergency group, they are nationwide. If you're lucky enough to live near one, I highly recommend them. They only see emergency cases. They see all types of animals, so dogs, cats. The great thing about it, you get to stay with your pet the entire time. They were having wild birds dropped off while we were there. And when sorry for being all over the place. When I say you get to stay with your pet the entire time, we were able to look through the door into the room where they were doing some imaging on Abe when they needed to do that to check to see if his stomach was still in torsion. Okay, so back over to the second dog specific thing. Worsening of neck compression of the spinal column is another potential side effect of radiation treatment. And the reason for that, once again, is because the dog's being placed under anesthesia. And so, they're not able to use their own strength to protect those neck muscles. And so when they're placed, you can just think about it when they're lifted and placed onto the platform, when they're lifted and taken back off the platform, they're not able to, use their own strength and their own muscles, what they would normally do to keep the compression off those cervical discs. And in addition, I'm not really sure what it looks like when they're strapped to the table on how that is, if there's potentially any kind of compression, additional compression introduced to the neck area during that. So anyway, it's definitely a potential side effect of radiation. What happened in our cases, or in Abe's cases, after completing radiation, he began to have problems with his gait. And at first this was transient, and we suspected it was just an electrolyte imbalance because he was not eating well. And when I say he was not eating well, I mean, there are some days when we were syringe feeding him baby food just to get food down him. Over time, over the course of about a couple of months, his appetite in general progressively got better. However, in the beginning, and on a few select days, it's kind of like a roller coaster. There's always ups and downs, and there were some serious valleys in there. And on those days, it was a struggle really to get anything down. So anyways, his irregular gait, when it comes to the electrolyte imbalance, this is a house full of scientists. We were getting him the electrolytes he needed after we started suspecting that. However, his gait didn't improve, and it progressed to severe imbalance along with that irregular gait. Now, at first, we thought it might be radiation-induced myelopathy, and this is where nerve tissue dies due to the radiation exposure. The radiologist assured us that that was not what was going on, and what was really happening wasn't evident to me until later. So Abe's complete radiation treatment included 5 separate rounds. So this is 5 times where he was put under anesthesia and placed into that rotating machine, and picked up likely while he was under. I don't know where they administer the anesthesia, but I imagine he was moved, manually moved as well, while he's under anesthesia. So anyways, he already had a degenerative disc in his cervical spine. So this is something known as wobbler syndrome. It can affect any breed. And even though surgery is an option, dogs have to be kept with restricted movement for 2 to 3 months following surgery to give the discs of the cervical spine time to fuse together. More often, wobblers is treated with NSAIDs. And in Abe's case, especially, he was on NSAIDs. So ultimately, with progression, wobblers causes dogs to lose coordination in their front and back legs. They're unable to control movement, and nerve impulses are affected going both to and back up to their brain. So this leaves the dog essentially unable to get up, and once up, it leaves them unable to walk because they're not able to feel their legs. And even if they could feel them, they can't control them. Progression of the disease. So honestly, at that point, when they're unable to get up on their own and walk, people opt for euthanasia. Progression of the disease includes loss of control of involuntary muscles as well, like the diaphragm for breathing. And so this ultimately goes back to that last point of inaction being an option. If we'd chosen the course of no treatment, then wobblers almost certainly wouldn't have been the cause of Abe's death. Yeah, that osteosarcoma probably would have killed him inside of 3 months from diagnosis, but he'd have gotten more days of activity and more days of appetite than he had with our decision to treat him with radiation. And ultimately, that's what's so heartbreaking about it, is making the wrong choice. That our decision didn't buy him any improved quality of life. And it didn't extend his life by any measurable amount. So, and this is where that guilt comes back up, because sometimes you make the decision of no action from a place of finances. Sometimes it's from a place of time constraints. Sometimes it's from a place of not being able to figure out how you're going to manage this, in addition to work and life and everything you have going on. So I think this is just an invitation to give yourself some grace and know that it's okay to make the decision of no action. And it's not something to invite additional guilt into your life. It's just knowing that that decision is okay too. So next time on the show, my friend Jenny Estay shares how dogs have helped her manage her anxiety. She's the founder of Wag Theory, a company that makes, well, they make all kinds of dog jackets, dog hands-free dog leashes, dog accessories, great poop bags, and also really cute bandanas. And she'll be here next time to share, yeah, her love of dogs and how, again, how her two boys have helped her manage her anxiety. To briefly recap what we've talked about in this episode, we started off with talking about how diet matters. It's how it's okay to be your own health advocate. That whatever you're going through, it's okay to mix and match Western medicine with everything else. It's okay to use Western medicine along with Ayurveda, along with acupuncture, along with energy massage, along with whatever it is in order to manage. And really, we live in a world where you don't have to pick and choose. You can do everything, and all of it together can be so beneficial and so much greater than just any one of those singly. And then lastly, and again, this is kind of where it becomes more of hopefully being in a situation where you are the caretaker, and hopefully this is of an animal and not of a person, of choosing no action, and how that really is okay too. And that decision should not be interwoven with guilt. All right. In case you're going through this for the first time. So for me, one of my biggest triggers during this whole process was when I told them Abe wasn't eating, of them saying, oh, well, did you try so-and-so? Like, they think I'm not thinking of this 24/7 on what to try to get him to eat. Now, in case so it was a huge trigger for me. That said, there were some really weird combos that helped a lot. The most unsuspecting one was something I'd been prescribed myself by my naturopath. So it's bioactive colostrum powder mixed with sour cream. And for whatever reason, I could almost always even if he wouldn't eat that mixture. So I would warm it up and be sure that it's warm, again, in keeping with Ayurvedic principles, and make a paste out of it. So I would not heat the colostrum powder. I would heat up the sour cream beforehand, or just add a little bit of warm water to the sour cream to get it thinner, and then add the colostrum powder to it. And once I did that, I would make a paste. And even if I could not get Abe to touch that, I could take a little bit of it and put it on his gums. And oftentimes, and when I say oftentimes, I mean 90% of the time, I don't recall a time when I did that where he still turned his nose up at it. Oftentimes when I did that, so I would say close to 100% of the time, if not 100% of the time, when I did that, that would spur him at least to eat that mix. And oftentimes, once he started eating, I was able to get him to eat something else. So that is the biggest one. The other one is substituting kibble that was not his normal kibble. And this is one where I was sure he wasn't going to eat it, because he was not eating things like chicken and rotisserie chicken and canned chicken and smoked salmon and tuna and mackerel and like hamburger. He wasn't eating those things, but for whatever reason, substituting kibble, and I'm talking with the cheapest grocery store stuff you could find, like Kibbles and Bits, which is completely different from his normal diet, he would eat that. And so that was really quite surprising. It's actually my husband who came up with that one. I can't take credit for that one. So anyways, for a full list of resources on everything that I can remember that we tried and what Abe would eat at least sometimes and what he would not eat, visit today's show notes for that list in case you're going through this on your own or know somebody who's going through this. As always, please send your feedback on today's episode. Well, first of all, thank you for listening to today's episode. This one was, I struggled with knowing whether or not it was okay to air this one. And ultimately I went ahead and aired it, mostly because I felt the need to talk about it. However, I think that was quite personal and quite maybe coming from my own selfish personal need for sharing this. So thank you so much for listening. And please let me know whether you found this beneficial, whether you found it informative. You can always reach me at hey@reinorganica.com. And if you happen to know anybody who's dealing with this right now on their own or dealing with this right now, please take a quick second and share this episode with them. All right, until next time, thank you so much for listening. Bye.